Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest webinar in our series of presentations designed to help Kansas companies expand their exports. My name is Jeff Willis, and I'm the Director of the International Division here at the Kansas Department of Commerce. This morning, we are particularly pleased that we can bring you a program on a subject that is anything but pleasurable. That is, the disruptions that all of us are experiencing in the supply chains that bring finished goods, component parts, and all manner of elements of production into the U.S., and in turn also has an impact on the export of goods out of the U.S. This is a complicated subject with many different aspects to it. Today, we hope to shed some light on the problems with our nation's supply chain and provide some ideas about how companies may be able to better cope with the present situation. To do this, we've invited two representatives of area companies that can speak directly to those points. Coincidentally, they both also happen to be board members of the International Trade Council of Greater Kansas City, which is a leading trade education and networking organization serving our community. And for all of you on this webinar who want to expand your involvement with the broader trade community here in the Greater Kansas City area, I strongly recommend you consider membership in the ITC. This session will be recorded and will be accessible via our website once it has been posted. We look forward to any questions you may have, so please post them at any time in the chat box. At the end of the presentation period of the program, we will go over those questions and hopefully have some good answers for you. Well, we have a lot to cover, so let's get to the program. Our first speaker is Jay Devers. Jay is an accomplished business development executive with an entrepreneurial background. He is managing partner of Bestway International Incorporated, Kansas City, Missouri. Founded in 1988, Bestway is a U.S. customs broker and international freight forwarder, representing Hellman Worldwide Logistics since 2006. In 2017, Bestway International was presented the President's E Award for Export Service by U.S. Secretary of Commerce Wilbur Ross. That's the highest recognition any U.S. company can receive for making a significant contribution to the expansion of U.S. exports. Jay is a 1993 graduate of Northwest Missouri State University with a BS in International Business. He is currently a board member of the International Trade Council of Greater Kansas City and the World Trade Center, Kansas City, and is active in the World Trade Council of Wichita, Kansas. He is the 2019 Legacy of Service Award honoree of the International Trade Council of Greater Kansas City. Well, without further delay, I give you Jay Devers.
Jeff, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to present this morning. I wish we had a topic that was more fun to talk about, but this is the world we live in right now.
Very muted.
Excuse me, Jay. I think you accidentally muted yourself.
Hey, that's better. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, great. I'm going to proceed to sharing my screen now. Well, first of all, thanks again for inviting me, Jeff. That was a very nice introduction. Had a real quick look at the attendee list for this morning and saw a ton of familiar names and faces. Can't wait to get back out and see you all again. I wish we had something a little more fun to talk about this morning, but this is the world we live in. Again, Jay Devers, Managing Partner, Bestway International here in Kansas City. Thanks again, Jeff, for the nice introduction. Let's jump right in here. In my time this morning, I'd like to just talk briefly about how did we get into this disruptive situation with the supply chain. These are questions that everybody's asking right now. When are things going to get back to normal? And what is being done by companies to survive and thrive in these current situations? So supply chain is an overused word, but in this case, we know that a chain is only as strong as the weakest link. And there are many links in the supply chain. Unfortunately, almost all of them are experiencing stress right now. So let's jump right in and talk about what's going on. I think before we get started, we want to remind ourselves that COVID will dominate this conversation, appropriately so. But the supply chain and international trade environment wasn't exactly super stable when COVID hit 18 months ago. We had tensions driven by U.S. tariff policy with China that was going on. We had Chinese retaliation that was happening primarily in the agriculture space, which is near and dear to our exporters' hearts here in Kansas, Missouri. And so what were people doing at the time that all this happened? Well, they were moving inventories around to try to beat the tariffs, work around the trade policies. There was a lot of changing of source vendors from one country, maybe in the Pacific Rim, to other countries. And so there was a tremendous amount of movement and unsettlement going on when COVID hit. And that's something that's somewhat important. So when we talk about what's happening in the supply chain, we're really talking about a collapse and a surge. So we've all seen graphs like this, and we all remember it very freshly in our minds. But there was a big slowdown and in many cases a stop in international trade. So what was going on last year? Really breaking down the collapse, from March to May, generally speaking, we had lockdowns. We had workers displaced. Manufacturing was cut. In the world of logistics, flights were changed, sailings were changed, routes were canceled, massive disruption. And then from June through December, and we're experiencing kind of the second wave of this now, is kind of what we hear as the new normal. So people are trying to make the adjustment to, a post-COVID lifestyle. One of the outcomes of this was, a massive shift in e-commerce, a massive shift in online purchasing. Why? Well, there was several months worth of pent-up demand, and I think there's no doubt that around the world, the economic stimuluses that were put in place by a number of almost every government around the world, drove demand. And so I pulled these statistics from Accenture, but no surprises here. Fortune 100, Fortune 1000 companies are declaring, 94% of them are declaring supply chain disruptions. 75% of these companies are having a negative impact, and 55% of companies in the Fortune 1000, continue to downgrade their growth outlook. So this is not great news that we're talking about, and we're all feeling this right now, especially here in the Midwest. So basically, when we talk about our situation, we're revealing the fact that this supply chain is incredibly reliant on all of the different pieces of the supply chain. So ocean freight shipping, air freight shipping, trucking, the railroads, warehousing and distribution, they're all intertwined and they're all struggling right now. So let's dive into that real quick. Just looking at containers alone, most people in the trade feel like, ocean shipping is kind of the base infrastructure of the international trade environment. Containers, just the containers themselves, due to work material shortages, the price of containers themselves has doubled. A container typically was around $3,000 to manufacture. Now it's around $6,000 just for the box itself. And we're going to talk a lot about the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach, and rightfully so. Those ports account for 40% of the imports that come into the United States, and therefore it's kind of the highest profile part of the crisis that we're seeing right now. Interesting statistic, when you look at those two ports, comparing June 2020, which is kind of the recovery from COVID, to June 2021, exports are up 27, or I'm sorry, Port of LA imports are up 27%, exports are down 12%. You're going to hear me talk about imbalance. You can see the imbalance right there. We all remember when the Ever Given ship, almost 20,000 containers, got jammed in the Suez Canal. That displaced over 500,000 containers and took weeks and weeks and weeks to rebalance. And then, of course, we've had port closures in the Pacific Rim. There's been port closures related to weather, and there's been port closures related to COVID-19 related shutdowns from the abundance of caution that some of these countries have applied as it relates to COVID-19. Those events on their own have displaced, over 350,000 containers. So we've got containers out of position. This leads to an increase in freight costs. For those of you who are importing and exporting, you guys know all about this. What have we got going on? Well, it's 20% of the world's global supply of large ocean shipping liners is actually under construction right now. This is fantastic, but most of these ships are not going to be in production until 2023. They take a long time to build. We're also seeing these larger container ships, 18, 20,000 containers. When one of these ships arrives in a port, you can imagine that creates a lot more stress for the onshore resources, the cranes, the trucks, the railroads, and all that. So what we've seen here recently is a 13-fold increase in containerized freight from China to the United States. Unfortunately, what you've seen is only about a doubling of the cost of that Trans-Pacific lane for exports. This creates a real problem, especially for those of us here in the Midwest, because these ocean carriers are for-profit entities, right? And so it's more profitable for them to turn that container around, in some cases empty, send it back to China, and make the higher freight rates than it would be to put it on a train or a truck, bring it into the middle of the country and reload it for freight for export. So just the imbalance there between the imports and the exports has made it more difficult to obtain container space exporting from the Midwest. Looking at ports, another big link in the chain. So we've got a situation we've all probably heard of where at any given time, I think this morning we were in the 80 to 100 range of vessels at anchor outside of the port of Long Beach and LA just to get in there and get unloaded. We're about 2.5 times more of that right now than what we had in a normal situation before COVID-19. What's going on with the ports? Well, COVID lockdowns and labor-related issues have impacted them. I mentioned weather before, and also the ports are transitioning to not necessarily more of a 24/7 operating window, whereas previously the ports were, on an 18 to 19 hour a day operating window. So we're trying to see the ports work, more on an around-the-clock basis. Looking at the trucking, we hear a lot about that, especially here in the Midwest. So even prior to COVID, we were experiencing a truck driver shortage. And that's really been exacerbated by the conditions of the last 18 months. So what's going on with truck drivers? Well, if you look at the median age of truck drivers, it's way up there, and it's a lot higher than the median age of a regular workforce. So more truck drivers are retiring. There's been a wave of safety regulations that have changed, some would say for the better, but certainly from a labor side, challenged the ability to hire truck drivers. And of course, a lot of truck drivers were displaced by COVID and, have been in an unemployment situation and also made lifestyle changes. So they don't necessarily want to go back to that truck driving lifestyle. In addition, if you look at the business itself, the trucking industry is highly fragmented. The average trucking company out there has 5 trucks, so most of these are small operators, and they're in competition with the large fleet haulers. Walmart, I don't think you can turn on your car radio for very long without hearing a commercial for Walmart recruiting truck drivers. Walmart is offering truck drivers upwards of $80,000 or $90,000 in salary, signing bonuses, and other benefits to get them to come over. And so the fleet haulers are pulling, those premium drivers out of these small companies. And so we're looking at, depending on what graph you want to follow, we're looking at, what is generally thought of as 100,000+ drivers short. So, we're missing capacity to go pick up that freight at the ports. Railroads are also involved with this. So, the railroad hubs are essentially big bottlenecks in the supply chain. You hear a lot about the Chicago situation. We're really lucky here in the Midwest because we've got the Gardner-Edgerton intermodal. That facility is lifting 13, 14, 15,000 containers a day. And I recall when they opened the facility, their ultimate capacity there is over 20,000 containers a day. That's great for us, and it's really good for our importers and exporters here in the Midwest, because we've got a little better access to these containers than almost any other market in the country. But the railroads have been affected by COVID and furloughs, massive furloughs in the railroad business, and that industry has been specifically challenged getting workers to come back to work. What was also unfortunate in the railroad business is they pre-COVID were in the process of rolling out this precision scheduling, operating model, which is essentially kind of the railroad version of just-in-time delivery. And that was incredibly ill-timed when COVID hit. And then, of course, every railroad hub, whether it's at the port or here in our neck of the woods, is stressed by access to the trucking. The trucking thing is going to be pervasive through every link of the supply chain. And then, of course, warehouse and distribution. We're super lucky here, and we've had an incredible amount of economic growth in our area. We have over 30 million operating feet of warehouse space here at Kansas City, and that's continuing to grow. No small effort through all of the economic development that's gone into that, including KC Smartport and all of the other entities. But we've got a situation there with labor. They say there's almost 500,000 jobs open in warehousing and distribution. I've got some friends at the Wyandotte County Economic Development Office, and last I spoke with them, they had over 5,000 jobs available in Wyandotte County, most of which were in supply chain, warehouse, and distribution. That's amazing. 5,000 jobs in one county in the state of Kansas. So in the world of warehousing, we're seeing a 20% increase in pricing. Where does this manifest itself as a link? Well, if these warehouses are not available or they're full, now you don't have a place to take the cargo to break it down and distribute it. You're also seeing warehouse investing is up 45% since COVID. So basically, the point here is there's imbalance. Almost every facet of the supply chain that affects getting goods from their source to your use and consumption is out of whack right now. And so the next question is obviously, when are things going to return to normal? This is a great question, and we hear this all the time. And unfortunately, it's not going to be soon. The general consensus, whether you talk to people in government resources or you talk to people in my industry in freight forwarding and distribution, nobody feels like it's going to be back to normal until around the middle of 2023. And even then, most of us in this business really feel like, the value of the container is going to be, $8,000 to $10,000, unfortunately, where, a year or two ago, it was, in the $4,000 or $5,000 range was kind of the benchmark. So not great news. So what's going on here? Well, we need time and we need demand to help rebalance the situation. On the capacity side, we've got to get the ports operating more and really more efficiently. There's a tremendous amount of work to be done, and you're starting to hear it being done with not only having the ports be available to unload more, but also doing a better job adding efficiency to the containers once they are inland and can get them out of the yard, out of the rail yard, and eliminate the backups. This labor thing is going to continue to challenge everybody in the supply chain, because getting people to return to the workforce, these are not work from home jobs. These are real labor jobs that have to be done in person. And so you're affected by the unemployment rate. You're affected by employment conditions. You're affected by COVID lockdowns. These things, and as long as these things are still going to be around, they're going to affect the supply chain. And then, of course, in our world, we've got these big cycles. So we've got Chinese New Year coming up in 2022 here, and not too, in early February. That's a massive disruption to the supply chain under normal operating conditions. Obviously, Chinese New Year 2023, there's the peak seasons that involve, holiday buying and things like that. There's a lot of gloom and doom that we hear about, your Christmas presents are sitting out at anchor waiting to be unloaded. So this is I guess the main point here is this is not something that you come in on Monday next week and it's all fixed. This is going to take months and months to rectify itself. This is something that we want to share with you offline, but looking into what do you do to survive and what do you do to thrive? Well, really, you need to take a partnership. Communication is huge. But I've got a couple ideas here that I want to share with you. You know, looking into 7 ways the supply chain can fail. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but the purpose of this particular slide is just to say, hey, let's compartmentalize what's going on. And then once we kind of identify and divide the areas, then we can kind of add in mitigation strategies. And if you can come back and say, hey, 4 or 5 of these areas, I really have some plans where I can feel like we have different options to be more resilient as an exporter, you're going to be in better shape. Obviously, the message here is, hey, let's not just hold our nose and hope it's going to get better. You know, let's have a plan. So looking into this a little bit, you know, I think you'll see when you look at studies and you talk to people like us and other economic development experts, resilience is the word that you come back to. So what does that mean specifically? Well, looking into what companies are doing to add resilience, they're dual sourcing materials. So they're purchasing people and their sales divisions are looking out there and saying, hey, listen, we need more suppliers. They're moving away from just-in-time inventory. They're actually adding inventory. That's one of the things that's created the massive growth in warehousing and distribution, is because people are ramping up inventory. If you think about that, that's the polar opposite of kind of management strategy of the last 20 or 30 years of just-in-time inventory. Nearshoring is huge. You know, you see a lot of nationalism right now and people trying to figure out how to eliminate, you know, sourcing material from overseas and subjecting it to the supply chain. Nearshoring can also mean, you know, let's move it back to North America, not necessarily the United States, where there's less touches of the inventory. And of course, you know, you've got companies out there that are saying, hey, we've got too much going on. Maybe we need to take the lower 30% of our SKUs and retire those so we can not have so much stress in our inventory and in our catalog. So those are just a couple examples of what you see of what's going on out there. The bad news with this is, you know, resilience has a lot of benefits, but it's a lot of work. You know, I can tell you that my team here have done an amazing job managing through this, but they're also working 3 or 4 times harder to move the same amount of freight, which is fine. You know, we'll do it, and it has to be done. But this resilience involves a lot more work. And unfortunately, you know, 58% of supply chain executives polled just last month say that it's going to add cost. If you think about these mitigation strategies, this adds cost. And what does that result in? Well, it's inflation, you know, and we're feeling that as we see the price of raw materials and everything that any inefficiency in the supply chain adds cost to the products. So really wrapping up my side, you know, what are organizations doing to survive and thrive? We have a number of checklists based on what operating entity that you are in, whether you're importing, whether you're exporting, whether you're doing both of those things. All of our partners, including Jeff and Kat and Lou and everyone at the Kansas Department of Commerce, AJ Anderson in Wichita, they've got resources. We've got resources. We're in almost daily communication. If you're struggling and you need some ideas, reach out to one of us. We have, as Jeff mentioned, an incredibly robust international trade support community in our area, and definitely take advantage of that. A checklist you're going to see on a PowerPoint slide is probably not the best fit for you. What we need to do is, you know, really understand exactly what's going on with your business and help you work through this, because it's just not going to be an overnight thing to get out of this. Again, I want to thank Kansas Department of Commerce for this event. It's a pleasure to present with you guys. Candidly, speaking on behalf of myself and the rest of the team, we miss you guys and can't wait to get back out there some more and see everybody. So with that, I will return the control and thank you. I look forward to questions and comments.
Well, thank you very much, Jay. We had a couple of issues with some of the sequencing of things, but obviously your expertise in the area speaks for itself. And so any questions that come in, we'll go ahead and address those at the end of the session after our next speaker has a chance to speak as well. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Lesa Brownell. Lesa is a Global Center of Excellence Compliance Manager at TVH Parts, Company Americas region, is also a certified U.S. Export Compliance Officer and certified global business professional whose responsibility includes international trade compliance, product compliance, and risk management. Lesa has over 30 years of international trade and compliance experience, traveling worldwide, helping companies to implement compliance programs. She previously worked for Honeywell FM&T, where she developed their deemed export compliance program, a supply chain management program, university trade compliance program, and worked collaboratively with the Department of Energy to write regulatory policies. Lesa volunteers as the treasurer for the International Trade Council, is a facilitator for Trade Winds, and in her personal time is an event planner for a nonprofit organization supporting women-owned businesses, which provides funds to local charities. She earned her master's degree in business ethics and compliance at New England College of Business and her bachelor's in international business at Park University. So without further delay, I'd like to pass it over to Lesa for her presentation and ask her to go ahead and make sure she shares her screen, and we ought to be good to go.
Thank you, Jeff. All right, Jay, appreciate everything there. Let's make sure here. I'm going to share my screen. I thought. Okay, why is it not sharing? Excuse me here.
We appear to have a problem with that today. So with that, we can go ahead and run the PowerPoint deck for you, and you just indicate to us when you want the next slide transitioned.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, very good. When I put it in presenter mode, it seems to have a little bit of a challenge. We can try it, see what it does, or I can leave it here if we're good. So yeah, we'll try it. Okay. Okay, very good. Yes, no problem. You can see. Very good.
See the notes.
You see my notes.
See the notes as well.
I don't know how to get rid of that. Okay. If I pull out. All right. Well, the notes are the same. Okay. All right. So if you're okay with this, I'm going to leave it like this because I'm technically challenged here.
Sounds good. That's your expertise we look for. Thank you.
All right. So Jay has given you a wonderful recap so you have a better understanding of the supply chain challenges, right? So, you know, there's many companies that are actually facing the severe shortage of goods, and delays have become the norm. And alternate suppliers are becoming relevant, where, you know, we all watch the news and it really makes you wonder what's really happening. You know, the fuel's going up, transportation, you know, space available on ships, on planes, you know, the shortages of chassis is not only just containers, and when they come in, they want you to discharge them at the port so they can hurry up and turn them around. You know, you've got driver shortages on both sides. Rail yards, actually, as Jade mentioned, you know, they're shut down just so that they can catch up with backlogs. And so driver shortages come in because you're trying to get cargo from a facility, you know, from the port, which actually you know, today warehouses, you know, a lot of companies are stopping their containers at the port, and then they're going to a warehouse to unload and then trucking it down. Well, now that has created an increased volume in warehouses that are full at all the ports, and virtually the cost of everything going up, right? So just statistic wise, as Jay had mentioned, there's over 100,000 drivers that are short. It is expected that driver shortage will go up to even double. And when you're looking at year-over-year volumes, right, October's imports, yes, there was a 3% increase over 2020, but overall there's a 29% or 23% increase from 2019. But let's look at it from again, my background is compliance, also logistically working in international trade. So I'll talk to you from multiple different angles here of things you really just got to be careful and to consider, right? So first thing is, people are all source suppliers in a different region. Okay, be very careful when you are switching suppliers in a different region. Your supplier that new supplier, right, they may source a piece part component from Asia that's still going to create a backlog for you when you're receiving the goods. So you have to know where they're sourcing their raw material, right? And it takes time to onboard a new vendor. Compliance has to be able to react rapidly, but we don't want to negate the need for compliance, because we want to ensure that your suppliers are not buying raw material from regions of embargoed countries. They're sourcing it from slave labor requirements. So there's still a due diligence that's still needed that has to remain in place to avoid the overall big compliance risk, right? So when you're looking to evaluate alternative inbound logistics options, containers, today are $30,000 per container. That, looking at air freight is also an option to look at, but again, that's space availability, because even planes are getting crowded. So it depends on how fast that you actually need it to be able to get in. The other thing is charters. Today, a vessel, a steamship line vessel holding 18 to 20,000 containers is actually only has limited ports, because it's such a huge vessel. You have to have a certain amount of depth of water. Versus if you're going to a charter, there's over 150 ports in the US that a charter can actually go to, because a charter vessel is only going to hold 8 to 10,000 containers. Now, with that in mind, understand the Walmarts and the Home Depots and the larger organizations, they're already chartering vessels. They're already doing a lot of this volume. So it's capacity, it's about availability. It is an option. How reliable and how quick and often, is things that you have to look at. Drop shipments. Olathe here, we are the headquarters, and so we actually will distribute product to our distribution warehouse locations, but we have now started, well, we have been, but we've increased it even more. We're actually doing drop shipments to not only to our different warehouse locations, but also to our customers. And that avoids long delivery times, where we might have a container going from a vendor that goes to a customer in Puerto Rico, or anywhere in South America, or anywhere, in Canada. And that helps with freight charges. That helps with the delay times and transportation as well. But obviously, if your customer is ordering in volumes of full container loads, that's where it proves to be beneficial for you. And as I mentioned, unloading containers at the port, that is where you will more likely get a booking much quicker versus the container that's going to take up longer amount of time to reach you inland. Not only from a rail shortage and time delay there, but also the trucker shortage, the chassis shortage. So these steamship lines are concerned about getting their containers back, because they want to hurry up and get them back overseas so that they can export more from their country for the US to import, right? So unloading a container at the port is an option that you can get a booking faster. But again, you also have the delay and shortages right now that are happening with warehouses. So as Jay mentioned, there's lots of different options, and be open and flexible to many different ways. Diversify your supply base. Add more sources in locations that are not necessarily vulnerable to risks, right? Consolidate and negotiate volumes directly with some of your suppliers. Where before you were ordering with a supplier, you had, air freight volumes, you had one skid or two skids. Consolidate that. Build your orders up where you're actually, consolidating into full container loads, getting more volume directly, because now you have to start to execute those pre-buys so that you have inventory. So as buyers, you've always had the requirement where you're planning and what you're buying. And so now it's even more so, you have to plan even further, right? And then consolidating. If you are a larger company and you have the opportunity with other business units, being able to consolidate across those business units where you're pooling those products that you're buying from vendors. So we have the opportunity, availability from multiple warehouse locations globally around the world that we can actually source product from any of our other business unit locations, which helps quite a bit. Be aware of your supplier's industry, right? I don't know how well you know your supplier, but if you don't, get to know them. It's the same as knowing your customers, right? Because if your supplier sells to an industry like the automotive industry, you're going to have a significant impact of being able to receive those parts just because of their impact on the automotive industry when they shut down. So that has an impact of the delivery time. And then a couple new words. I don't know if they're actual words. I heard these were made up, is what was shared with me, is called froth and slosh. So be careful of this, right? Customers are placing orders with multiple suppliers, and then the first supplier that makes the order ready, then they cancel all the other orders with the suppliers. So if you're a supplier, right, and you're like, okay, great, my orders are revving up, I've got more orders and everything coming in. Those customers they're just placing orders for the first person that's actually going to be able to place it, and then they turn around and cancel it. So be careful of that. You know, when you're buying a new dishwasher, you buy from a preferred customer. It's because you can't buy from them because the product that you want is actually out of stock. So now you got to go buy it from somebody else. Well, you're not necessarily going to go back to that same store. Well, you as a seller are excited because somebody's buying. You know, your sales are increasing, and this is great. But it's short run, right? Because they're not in some cases, right, where they might not necessarily buy from you as might not necessarily be long-term customers. So I hope they are, I truly do. But those are things that are actually happening in industry right now. Sloshing, that's the wave, right? So whoever has inventory, they're going to go to that supplier, and then everyone is going to shift to another supplier. So you have multiple suppliers that you're sourcing products from, and this is your, supplier, this is your primary supplier. Well, then all of a sudden they are at capacity, they can't meet it, so they're going to weave and go to another supplier. Well, everyone else is following right along with them. So these are things that are actually happening. Be very careful and just aware of those things. And adjusting your forecast for pre-buy inventory, right? These are things already that are happening that, be careful not to overbuy. If your products have a shelf life, those are things that you have to be cognizant of, as well as space availability. So just from our parent company, on any given week, we are unloading 7 containers a week. And that's just from the parent company. That isn't including all of our other products that we have coming in. And so, that turnaround where you want the inventory, do you actually have the space, and you're going to look for other space? Well, do you really need it in this short-term, pandemic of everything that's happening? And I say short-term because I expect it to still happen in 2023 when we start to see it to phase its way out. And as Jay said, it's just going to take some time, right? Another thing is assists. So for those of you to understand, I don't know if you understand what an assist is, I'll explain briefly, but basically when you provide a piece part component to a supplier and they build that finished product for you that you import, that's an assist that you have given them. And that has to be declared to customs when you're importing. And just the same as if they need tooling, right, to help build your product. So one of the things that we've done, and other vendors and other companies are doing as well, is if our primary vendor that is building products for us cannot source components because their supplier of raw materials cannot make those piece part components available, then we're reaching to our sources. Let us help you, right? And we're providing them those piece part components so that they can finish the subassemblies of the items we're buying from them. But again, it's called an assist, and it's something from a risk that you have to make sure that is declared through customs of what's happening there. Okay. Landed cost adjustments. Right now, right, our freight charges are fluctuating. So never, and I cannot express this more strongly, don't quote customers an all-in price. In the US, we don't pay duties and taxes on freight charges. And so goods that are coming in from China, which all of you should be familiar with Section 301, the provisional duties on the 25% tariff. If a price is quoted to the vendor is giving us a quote that is all in, well, now we're paying that duties and taxes and any 25% provisional tariff on the freight charges when it's not otherwise applicable, right? And don't quote all-in prices to your customers, because drop shipments that you're making to your customers, those freight charges are way too unpredictable right now. And just like the US doesn't pay duties and taxes on freight, your customers may or may not, depending on what country that they're actually in as well when you're doing those. So when you're calculating your landed cost, right now that's an ongoing thing, right? So in May, a container cost $18,000 to, today it's $25,000. The freight charges are fluctuating. You have Section 301 provisional duties. They've been here since 2018. You have anti-dumping tariffs. November 23rd, they've got a huge anti-dumping tariffs that's going to be impacted as well, that's coming in, as well as Section 232 on your aluminums and steel. So these are landed cost adjustments, not only for your freight charges that you're looking at, but you also want to make sure that your duties and taxes and these provisional tariffs are also included in your landed cost, so that you can accurately reflect your true margin, so that when you are changing from one vendor to another, you still need to look at these charges as well. And be sure to address any hidden risks, right? When you are switching from a vendor, your primary vendor, you hopefully have already obtained the chemical restriction requirements. You have REACH and RoHS in the EU. We have the TSCA restrictions. We have Prop 65 product restrictions. With exports going into Mexico, you have the no marking requirements. So whatever you're importing, does it have the information so that you can export that, for those products and marking labeling requirements? Because if you're switching to a new vendor, you can't negate compliance, that you have the information from your primary vendor, but now you need to make sure that you're adhering to those same chemical restriction requirements and data and information you need from a new vendor who manufactures the products. And that data and information is needed prior to procurement, because there are EPA restrictions, TSCA restrictions that when goods are imported into the US, that you have to fill out a TSCA certificate. And if you don't have that data or information, then your goods are actually seized by customs. So be very careful there. Products often incorporate, critical components of materials. And so they may require a specialized chemical, or they may require technical skills or certain tooling that's required. And so sometimes it's not always necessarily an option that you can switch to a new vendor because you've invested so much, within that vendor that's there. So look at alternatives, what you can do to help that vendor, right? But again, don't negate compliance, because there is a supplier due diligence that has to remain to avoid any compliance risks. In duty savings, prices are going up, but just one way of duty savings. Freight costs are increasing, we know that, but just a couple of ways that you can find some savings as well. U.S. Customs laws does allow for a duty exemption for items under Section 321, that if the value of the shipment is less than $800, then you don't have to pay that tariff provision. It's actually exempted from it, and it's one shipment per consignee per day. So sometimes air freighting in smaller quantities is a better option too, as well, to be able to bring things in. And then submitting your, for those of you, hopefully, if anyone is impacted under Section 301, the exclusion process for reinstatement, certain HTS codes under the exclusion, that process ends December 1 for your comment period. And that's an option that you can actually bring those in to find another way to be able to save duties and taxes. So, and I will stop sharing. Maybe, I hope.
Looks good. Thank you, Lesa.
Okay.
Wonderful presentation. Quite a lot of detail for all of our listeners. I really appreciate that level of, again, of clarity. Right now, we're going to go ahead and open up for questions from the audience. And I'll go ahead and do my best to direct them to both of you, and maybe I'll give time for each of you to be able to answer the question depending upon the subject. And again, you may have already touched upon some of the things that were presented within the chat, but if you want to revisit it and simply provide a little bit more consolidated response, that'll probably stick with people's minds as well. So the first question I have coming from a Kansas manufacturer that I know, how can we calculate or justify the actual increase in the cost of a container coming from Shanghai or Ningbo to the Midwest US? The cost increase of up to 8 times the previous amount seems very difficult to justify. And Lisa, you know, you're in the trenches with this, so I'm going to throw this your way first off. And how do you address with that kind of lack of ability to plan in any successful fashion, and to be able to address those dramatic increases in costs? What do you have to say?
Yeah, so unfortunately, yeah, we have a ongoing continuous pricing team that is, you know, manually adjusting, going in and updating the cost as we get the data and the information, you know, for freight charges. It's hard to predict because you can have a delay of 6 months, you know, to be out there, where we place an order with a vendor in April, and then the goods aren't even shipping to a, you know, ready to go to ship, and now you've gone an $8,000 increase in freight charges. So yeah, I mean, it's trying to forecast as much as you can. As I understand, Jay, and you can speak to this, we're at the peak right now of container costs, you know, being $30,000, so hopefully they won't go over that. But unfortunately, having the costs identified helps us to see our margins, but we've also had to do price increases throughout the year to our customers, and just helping them to understand, you know, the freight costs and data, you know, that we've had to do these price increases. But where we can, we have done drop shipments, as I mentioned before, to help the customers in any way that we can to help offset that cost. But yeah, I mean, honestly, it's just a constant monitoring of updating our landed cost. There's nothing else you can do right now.
Well, thank you very much. Clearly, this is a very difficult subject for any producer to have to address. Lisa, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, and that is because you've got such great experience in this. As you sort of forecast out any kind of crystal ball kind of considerations, I mean, is there any rule of thumb for the length of time that you should project out, or if it exceeds 3 weeks, absolutely not? Or, I mean, is there any sense you have on that? And then I'll ask Jay to be able to respond after you address that.
Well, you're already at a minimum of 6 months in projecting pre-buys. I mean, honestly, because the volume wise, I mean, our holiday season is, I don't want to say over, but from buying it's over, right? Because the holidays, the bigger companies, the Walmarts and, you know, all those organizations, they pre-buy, you know, back in June to be ready for the November, December timeframe, just because of the delays and the lags and everything that's happening. But at least 6 months, you have to look at that, yes.
Thank you. Jay, do you have something you'd like to add for the group?
Yeah, I think that question from Mike was a good one. How do you justify it? That's the question. I don't know how you can justify this. It's not good. To add to that, I think for those of you paying attention, Maersk, which is the largest container shipping line in the world, declared last week, I think it was, $16 billion in profits. That's up 68% over last year. So there's a tremendous amount of money being made. It's tremendously difficult to justify. It is a demand-driven market, and it's terrible. The calculation of it, Lisa brought up a great point, Jeff, too, that we've actually seen over the course of the last 2 weeks the first real meaningful decline in prices. Now they're still outrageously operating at a multiple of the prior situation, but we've actually seen a slight decline. And I think if you talk to most experts as it relates to the price of freight, that's going to continue. Now, is it going to get back down to what the benchmark was? It's before, around $4,000 a container. I don't think so. I think it's going to gradually ease itself back down to 7,000 or 8,000 a container, maybe a little more than that, and it's going to take another, a year and a half at least to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess that's sort of guardedly optimistic. I don't know how to characterize that, but thank you very much, Jay. Gives us a little room for optimism. I don't know how much either of you can directly address this question, but nevertheless, we're very interested in your perspective because you bring a very informed perspective as it relates to this supply chain issue. I'll first ask you, Jay, this, and it's a broad question regarding supply chain. Is there any chance we can bring manufacturing back to the United States? What are some of the obstacles that you see that might hinder this from happening from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's really no downside to that whatsoever. I think I touched on that, and Lisa did too, in terms of selecting vendors. But when you're talking about bringing it back to the United States, or even just bringing it back to North America, the first thing you do there is you eliminate a good portion of the supply chain that's failing right now. So that's good. One of the things that we don't talk about much, but our trade deficit with China has gone crazy over the course of COVID. It's tremendously worse than it was before. And as we all remember, we had a pretty good little trade rift going with China before this all started happening. So we've taken a number of extremely big steps backwards as it relates to the trade deficit, and that's not good for our economy in general. It's not good for Kansas exporters, and this consumerism that has gone crazy, let's call it that, hasn't been healthy for us. So I think the answer to that question is people are now more than ever really digging into nearshoring and taking these steps out of the supply chain that they can, and there's no real downside for that if it's possible.
Yeah, for us, if I could add to that, for us it's been a challenge. Short-term solution, yes, to U.S., but the problem has always been for us is that a lot of the U.S. manufacturing has not always been able to meet our capacity, to meet our demands. And so that gets to be a challenge. And as I understand, and I could be wrong here, the Ford plant is actually, right, when they had the whole chip shortage, they're actually building a plant themselves because they don't want to have to deal with this again. But when you're building a new facility, you're 2 to 3 years, right, for completion of that happening. So will it bring jobs back to the US? That's really based on your industry, honestly. Because it is about capacity.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
To add to that, Jeff, I mean, just over the course of this conversation between Lisa and I, we've talked about, over 500,000 jobs that are available now here in the U.S. that are open. So it starts to become really a introspective look at what's going on with our labor situation when we can't fill the jobs that we have open now, and that's part of one of the links of the chain that's under stress.
Well, thanks to both of you. Yes, clearly this is a subject that has is quite prominent now, and many people have turned their attention to trying to redress the situation. But as you said, Lisa, the lead time associated with bringing new capacity online is a little bit long for customers' present needs. That said, you've struck a chord with what we try to do here at the Department of Commerce as well, which is look at these issues of supply chain specifically and see what we can do to facilitate whether the reshoring activity of companies that are located outside, or looking at supply chain generally in ways in which we might be able to help companies meet some of their needs in that supply chain area. But clearly, it's a very difficult problem. It's been made more acute now, but I hope that soon we'll have some level of solution for it. We also have, as I look at the chat area, we have one person who's called in and said, "Well, what about Mexico? Can Mexico benefit from this disruption?" Jay, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't spent a lot of time on that, Jeff, but I will tell you that the answer to that is absolutely. So what a couple things that are going on the Mexico side. So first of all, their automotive production has just absolutely exploded over the course of the last 5 years. And so that's huge. The other thing, when you hear the term nearshoring, that's a popular term you hear. That typically means, well, not typically, but the context that I've heard it used means not sourcing from Asia, but sourcing from someplace in North America, which usually means Mexico. So they're benefiting there. And then another thing to keep an eye on is the port of Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico is a deep water port that's down in southern Mexico, very large capacity port, deep water port, non-union operating port. And so, you know, what we've seen in the past when there's been like labor issues in Los Angeles, Long Beach, is you've seen cargo kind of migrate to that port. And that's really, really interesting for those of us here in Kansas City, because that port is serviced by the Kansas City Southern Railroad. So in that their intermodal is here in Grandview, Missouri, you could actually have direct access to that port. So there's a lot of Mexico benefit and a lot of Mexico related activity that's going on here for sure.
Wonderful. Lisa, would you like to add anything? Otherwise, I have another follow-on question for Jay.
No, you're fine. Go ahead.
Okay, Jay, I really, as you present that circumstance, you talk about the port in Mexico. As a customer, when they want to talk with you about their own shipping concerns, what kind of considerations do you walk through with them to try to address some of these some of the anxiety they may have with regards to shipments outbound or inbound? Is there a tip you can provide that would facilitate things a little bit easier?
Yeah, it's get an ice pack ready is kind of the tip. So you know, one of the attendees I think hit it right on the head. I mean, how do you justify this? It's crazy. It takes a lot of patience, and it takes so you kind of have to divorce yourself from the way things were a couple of years ago, because they're just not that way right now. And specifically, I'll say as it relates to price and capacity. So we've gone through a situation with some of our clients, and maybe some of the ones that aren't as experienced as others, that, you know, what you can't do is have an overnight cycle where we're going to decide whether we're going to pay that rate or not, if that makes sense. Because by the time you spend an overnight cycle to say, hey, I want to, I'll go ahead and pay that $18,000 or whatever it is that Lisa mentioned. Hey, the space is gone. So you have to come to the negotiation ready to go. And the other thing too is there still are a large number of options for shipping. Lisa touched on that, and I probably should have stressed that more. And so you want to sit down with your customs broker, you want to sit down with your freight forwarder, you want to make sure that you're understanding all the different options and not just putting yourself up against, you know, the really bad one choice of cost and delivery time and all those things. You want to make sure that you're surrounding yourself with some options, but really just kind of being patient and understanding that, you know, how you did business 2 years ago, procuring freight is just not how it works right now. And so once you can accept that, you're going to have an easier time with things.
Well, thank you. Again, some great insight and some great tips for folks as they look to be able to work through these issues that we're all confronting. Lisa, is there anything else you'd like to add before we close out our session?
Just again, just to reiterate, you know, constantly on the phone with your freight forwarder who can actually help you to think outside the box, as Jay had said, just in different options and stuff. But, you know, I think probably most important for everyone to understand is that we're not in this alone. Everyone is feeling this. Everyone is going through this. So it is not going to be a surprise to your customers that costs are going up, right? But because your landed costs are going up. And so we try to work really closely with our customers in letting them know we're trying to help them to find alternative ways. And as I mentioned, drop shipping directly to them is one way that has cut a lot of transportation time away. But that also is encouraging them to buy in bigger volumes, you know. So if you're looking to place an order each month, well, let's look at your 3-month order capacity so that we know that that's coming in and put it in a full container versus smaller loads and things that are happening. But yeah, I mean, we're all in it together. So.
Well, thank you very much. And before we close out, I just have a last question for you, Jay. Another one just came in with regards to Mexico, and maybe you can address this for us. What security is there for cargo traveling from Mexico to the United States?
Yeah, that's a whole nother webinar right there.
Yes, it is.
But to make it very simple, the railroad, which is kind of one of the bigger focuses, it's basically trucking a railroad. You know, we don't get into a lot of air freight related issues with Mexico, but you know, the nice thing about the railroad is those trains, as long as they're moving, are pretty secure. There are situations with trucking where we've gotten into escorted cargo, where you've got a security escort that's traveling with the cargo. But the Kansas City Southern has actually got a number of very, very interesting presentations on the cargo security, and there's a lot more that goes into it than you can imagine. But it's a major issue and definitely a concern. If you're concerned about your cargo security, that's something that you would want to work in partnership with your freight forwarder on. On one hand, to make sure that the cargo is properly insured and the Incoterms are correct, but then also to make sure that we've got the right security protocol in place to make sure that it gets where it's supposed to go.
Well, wonderful. I want to again thank both of our presenters today. Extremely knowledgeable, well-versed in this subject area, and that's what we really need, all of us, when we've got such a rapidly changing landscape that is providing us with challenges that we really haven't seen before. So again, I want to thank the presenters for their expertise and their willingness to help us out. And I also want to thank all the attendees for being part of this webinar. As I said earlier, we will have the webinar available on the website, the Department of Commerce, Kansas Department of Commerce website, a little bit later on once we've had a chance to post it. And additionally, I know that some of the slides will be available as well to participants, the decks that were provided by our speakers. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending and welcome you to stay tuned, because we're going to have more webinars, as we have been having them on a monthly basis, addressing these subjects of great interest to Kansas manufacturers. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.